The unseen assumptions. The hum of the sleek black Tesla hummed as it glided effortlessly through the busy city streets. Inside, Olivia Davis sat behind the wheel, her polished fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel as the autopilot steered her toward her destination. Olivia glanced down at her smartphone, skimming through a series of emails that needed her attention. A couple of minor contracts, a charity gala invitation, and a business deal with a tech firm all awaited her response. She smiled to herself. Life had certainly come full circle. Years ago, she would have never imagined sitting in a car like this, much less having business deals that required million-dollar decisions. But those years were behind her. And now Olivia had become the owner of one of the most successful venture capital firms in the world. Her success was monumental, but the journey to reach it had been steeped in struggle, determination, and overcoming barriers others thought she could never surpass. But today, she wasn't thinking about her journey. Today, she was thinking about the upcoming charity event she'd agreed to attend. It was at a fancy new restaurant downtown, La Maison d'Or, a French bistro that had quickly gained a reputation for its elite clientele and world-class menu. Olivia had heard of the place but had never been. Her assistant had made the reservation, assuring her that everything would be perfect for her quiet night before her business meetings over the weekend. She exited the highway and merged into the bustling heart of the city. The restaurant was only a few miles away now. Olivia's reflection in the rearview mirror showed a calm, confident woman. Her dark skin gleamed under the soft light of the car, and her natural curls framed her face perfectly. She wore a simple yet elegant dark green dress, the kind that spoke of quiet sophistication rather than ostentatious wealth. As she neared the restaurant, Olivia couldn't help but reminisce. Growing up in the outskirts of the city, she had lived in a rundown apartment with her mother and younger brother. Back then, fancy restaurants were nothing more than a dream. They had to make do with whatever they could afford, and luxury was never part of the equation. She thought of the nights she had gone to bed hungry, vowing that one day she would rise above her circumstances. Now here she was, wealthy, powerful, and admired by many, though she never flaunted it. She preferred her privacy, opting to live a life that was grounded in authenticity, kindness, and humility. As the GPS directed her onto the final stretch, Olivia could see La Maison d'Or up ahead, its golden sign gleaming under the soft evening lights. The restaurant's exterior screamed exclusivity. Large glass windows framed the building, giving a glimpse into the opulent interior, where chandeliers sparkled, and patrons dined at tables adorned with white linens and gold-plated cutlery. Olivia pulled into the parking lot, stepped out, and handed her keys to the valet, who barely glanced at her. He was more focused on the other vehicles pulling in. An array of high-end sports cars and luxury sedans, driven by patrons who were, as expected, predominantly white. Olivia took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. As she approached the door, she noticed the host, a tall man in his mid-40s with neatly combed hair and an air of superiority. His eyes flickered toward her briefly before he went back to talking to another guest, as though she didn't exist. For a moment, Olivia thought nothing of it. She was used to being overlooked in these circles. People often assumed things about her, whether it was her background, her capabilities, or even her wealth. Prejudices ran deep, especially when they saw a black woman walking into spaces they didn't expect her to belong. She walked up to the host's stand and cleared her throat gently. The host looked up, and the faint smile he had worn for the other guests vanished. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice laced with thinly veiled contempt. "Yes, I have a reservation," Olivia said, her voice even and polite. "It's under Davis, Olivia Davis." The host's brow furrowed as he scanned the guest list. Olivia could see the shift in his demeanor. His eyes roamed over her attire, her skin, and back to the list, as though something wasn't quite adding up for him. "I don't see any reservation under that name," he said after a moment, his tone clipped. "That's strange," Olivia replied calmly. It was confirmed earlier today by my assistant. Maybe there's been a mix-up. The host's eyes darkened slightly as though her mere suggestion of a mistake had offended him. He glanced toward a table of well-dressed guests who were seated near the entrance, and Olivia could sense his growing discomfort. "This establishment is very exclusive," the host said, his voice growing colder. "We don't take walk-ins." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "I'm aware of that. That's why I made a reservation." The tension in the air was palpable now. The host's eyes darted toward a figure in the back of the restaurant, a man in his late 50s, wearing a tailored suit. It was the restaurant manager. The host waved him over subtly, and the manager, noticing the silent signal, approached them with an air of authority. "What seems to be the problem here?" the manager asked, his eyes flicking between the host and Olivia. "There's a woman here claiming she has a reservation," the host said, his voice dripping with skepticism. The manager turned to Olivia, his gaze scanning her from head to toe, his expression unreadable. After a beat, he simply said, "I'm sorry, but if you don't have a confirmed reservation, I'm afraid we can't seat you tonight. We're fully booked." Olivia felt her chest tighten slightly. She had dealt with subtle forms of racism throughout her career, but this was blatant. They didn't believe she belonged here. "I do have a reservation," she said firmly, her eyes locking with the manager's. "You can check again." The manager's lips pressed into a thin line. "With all due respect, ma'am, I think you might want to try somewhere else. Perhaps a place more suitable." There it was. The implication hung in the air like a heavy cloud. A place more suitable. A place where, in their minds, she would fit better. Olivia felt a wave of frustration wash over her, but she kept her composure. She wasn't about to let them treat her like this, but she also wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. Before she could respond, something unexpected happened. One of the other guests, seated near the entrance, recognized Olivia. His eyes widened as he nudged his companion and whispered something. Within moments, the hushed conversation spread through the front of the restaurant like wildfire. The manager, noticing the sudden shift in attention, frowned. He glanced back at Olivia, confused. His posture stiffened as he realized he might have made a grave mistake, but he still didn't know just how big of a mistake it was. Olivia's phone buzzed in her purse. She glanced at the screen, noting the incoming message from her assistant. It was a simple text, but it carried a lot of weight. "Your donation to the restaurant's charity fund has been finalized. They should be expecting you as their VIP guest tonight." Olivia smiled faintly, knowing that the tables were about to turn in ways the manager could never have imagined. The unraveling of assumptions. The tension in the air was thick as Olivia stood at the entrance of La Maison d'Or, her hand resting lightly on her purse as her phone buzzed once more. The restaurant manager, clearly unaware of who he was dealing with, maintained his stance, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face as he noticed the growing interest from the other patrons. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation, but it was already slipping from his grasp. Olivia straightened her posture, exuding an air of quiet confidence. She had dealt with situations like this before, people making assumptions based on her appearance, her skin color, her gender. But this time, there was something different in the air. It wasn't just about being turned away from a restaurant. It was about how people like the manager assumed they could wield their power without consequence. Today, however, would be a lesson in humility for him. "Look," the manager began, clearly hoping to de-escalate what he perceived as an impending scene. "I understand you believe you had a reservation, but we have a strict policy, and there are no available tables. I can offer to call another restaurant for you. Perhaps something more accessible." Olivia's lips twitched slightly at the word accessible. She knew exactly what he was implying, and part of her wanted to call him out right there and then. But she had learned over the years that patience often yielded far more effective results than anger ever could. "That won't be necessary," Olivia said coolly, her voice steady. She lifted her phone and began typing a response to her assistant, informing her that she had arrived and was dealing with a small issue. Olivia glanced up just as another figure appeared at the far end of the restaurant, one that made the manager's face drain of color. A woman dressed in a sleek, tailored black suit walked briskly toward them. She was tall, elegant, and exuded authority. As she reached the entrance, her sharp eyes immediately took in the scene. The woman, Olivia recognized, was Caroline DuPont, the owner of La Maison d'Or. Her face was etched with professionalism, but there was an underlying warmth to her, something that made Olivia think that maybe, just maybe, there were still people in these circles who understood the value of decency. "Is there a problem here?" Caroline asked, her voice carrying a hint of French accent, likely a remnant of her upbringing. The manager looked visibly uncomfortable as he tried to explain the situation, his words tumbling out awkwardly. Yes, Ms. DuPont. This woman claimed she had a reservation, but we've checked the list, and—" Caroline's sharp eyes turned to Olivia, and in an instant recognition lit up her face. Her eyes widened slightly, and she quickly stepped forward, brushing past the manager. "Ms. Davis," she exclaimed, her tone full of genuine warmth. "It is such an honor to have you here. I apologize for any inconvenience. I was informed that you would be our guest of honor tonight." The manager blinked, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. Instead, he stood frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. Olivia gave a small smile, inclining her head gracefully. "Thank you, Ms. DuPont. It seems there was a misunderstanding, but I'm glad we could resolve it." Caroline turned to the manager, her eyes narrowing slightly. "There seems to be a serious lack of communication here. This is Ms. Olivia Davis, one of the most influential venture capitalists in the country, and a major benefactor to our charity program. How could there possibly be a mix-up?" The manager's face flushed crimson, and his mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He stammered, "I didn't realize." "That much is obvious," Caroline interrupted, her tone sharp. She gestured for a passing waiter, who immediately rushed over. "Please escort Ms. Davis to our best table in the private dining room. I'll be there shortly to make sure everything is perfect for her evening." The waiter, sensing the gravity of the situation, bowed slightly and motioned for Olivia to follow him. Olivia nodded her thanks and began to walk toward the back of the restaurant, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. She could feel the eyes of the other diners on her, their whispers and hushed conversations filling the air. As Olivia entered the private dining room, a quiet sanctuary away from the prying eyes of the main dining area, she finally allowed herself to relax. The room was beautifully decorated, with soft lighting, elegant table settings, and large windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was a space meant for important guests, the kind of room where deals were struck and fortunes were made. But Olivia wasn't thinking about deals right now. She was thinking about the way the evening had unfolded, the subtle, and not so subtle, racism she had encountered, and how easily things could have gone differently if Caroline hadn't arrived when she did. She knew that for many people, experiences like this were a daily reality, and not everyone had the luxury of status or wealth to shield them from such indignities. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Caroline, entering the room with a look of sincere apology on her face. "I am so sorry, Miss Davis," Caroline said as she approached. "I assure you, this is not how we treat our guests, and I will personally make sure the situation is addressed with the utmost seriousness." Olivia smiled graciously. "I appreciate that, Ms. DuPont. I know these situations happen more often than people like to admit, but I'm not here to make a scene. I just want to enjoy my dinner and move on." Caroline nodded, her expression softening. "Of course. We will make sure your evening is as pleasant as possible." She paused for a moment, her eyes searching Olivia's. "If I may, I'd like to offer a more personal apology. I've seen this sort of behavior far too many times in my career, and it's always deeply upsetting. I started this restaurant with the hope of creating a space where everyone feels welcome. Clearly, we still have work to do." Olivia appreciated the candor. It wasn't often that people in Caroline's position acknowledged the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist. "It's good to hear that you recognize the problem," Olivia said. "Too often, people pretend it doesn't exist." Caroline nodded again, her gaze thoughtful. "It's a battle I'll continue to fight. I'm truly sorry that you had to experience that here, of all places." Olivia waved her hand dismissively. "It's not the first time, and I'm sure it won't be the last. But I hope that in the future, your staff will be better trained to handle situations like this with more care and respect." Caroline's eyes flashed with determination. "You have my word on that." With that, Caroline excused herself, leaving Olivia alone once more. She looked out at the view, the twinkling city lights stretching out before her. A quiet resolve settled over her. Tonight had been just another reminder of how far she had come, and how far there was still to go, not just for herself, but for others like her who faced prejudice and ignorance on a daily basis. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from one of her charities, a program she had started to support young Black entrepreneurs. She smiled at the timing. As she prepared to settle in for her meal, she thought of how this experience, like so many before, would only strengthen her resolve to continue making a difference, both in her personal and professional life. But outside the private dining room, the manager was reeling. Word had spread quickly among the staff, and the full realization of who Olivia Davis was had hit him like a freight train. He had made a grave mistake, one that would haunt him for the rest of the night, and perhaps far longer than that. Unbeknownst to him, the tables had already turned, and Olivia wasn't done yet. The ripple of consequences. Outside the private dining room, the atmosphere in La Maison d'Or had shifted dramatically. The restaurant manager, Richard Harlan, stood stiffly at the host's stand, staring at nothing in particular. His hands fidgeted behind his back, his usually composed demeanor shattered by the events of the evening. He had heard the whispers, how the guest he had dismissed as just another entitled customer had, in fact, been Olivia Davis, one of the wealthiest and most influential women in the country. He felt the weight of the realization settle over him like a heavy cloak. His chest tightened, and a slow wave of panic began to rise within him. Mistreating a regular guest was one thing, but mistreating someone like Olivia Davis was a mistake of monumental proportions, one that could cost him more than just his job. But it wasn't just the fear of losing his position that gnawed at him. Deep down, Richard knew what he had done was wrong. He had seen Olivia, made assumptions based on nothing but the color of her skin, and acted accordingly. The ugliness of it all simmered beneath his awareness, making him increasingly uncomfortable. He didn't want to admit that the decisions he made were influenced by prejudice, but the evidence was staring him in the face, and now, the consequences were unfolding in real time. Across the dining area, guests were beginning to take notice. The murmur of conversations, the glances in his direction, Richard could feel the judgment building. He glanced at Caroline DuPont, who had just reemerged from the private dining room. She was whispering urgently to one of the waitstaff, her face tight with frustration. The owner's usually calm and gracious composure had been replaced with the sharp focus of a woman determined to fix the damage. Richard knew that his fate likely hung in the balance. Caroline was a fair boss, but she had zero tolerance for anything that could tarnish the restaurant's pristine reputation. Mistreating a VIP guest like Olivia Davis was a cardinal sin, and Richard suspected that before the night was over, he would be asked to step down. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. But there was something more personal gnawing at him. The weight of his own actions, the subtle racism he had tried to justify in the moment, was beginning to press down on him like a heavy stone. He had acted out of ignorance and bias, and now, for the first time in a long time, he was forced to confront it. As Richard stood lost in his thoughts, the door to the restaurant swung open, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside. The tension in the room thickened as heads turned to watch them. The officers scanned the room briefly before making their way toward the host stand. Richard's heart skipped a beat. This was the last thing he needed tonight. More drama, more eyes on him. He instinctively stepped forward, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Good evening, officers," Richard greeted them with a forced smile. "Can I help you with something?" The taller of the two officers, Officer Martinez, glanced at a notepad in his hand before addressing Richard. "We received a call earlier from this location about a disturbance. The caller didn't leave much information, but we're just following up to make sure everything is all right." Richard's mind raced. He hadn't called the police, but the nagging memory of the situation earlier in the evening surfaced. He hadn't outright asked anyone to call the cops, but he had been moments away from doing so when he thought Olivia was a troublemaker who didn't belong in his restaurant. Perhaps the host, sensing Richard's attitude, had preemptively made the call. Either way, the presence of the officers now was an uncomfortable reminder of just how far things could have escalated if the situation hadn't been diffused. "Ah, that must have been a misunderstanding," Richard said, trying to sound nonchalant. "We had a small issue with a reservation earlier, but it's been resolved. No need for any further action." Officer Martinez raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "You sure? We got a report of someone causing a disturbance, something about a guest refusing to leave." Richard's mouth went dry. He could feel the eyes of the staff and patrons boring into him. He realized then that what could have been a minor incident had spiraled into something much larger. And now there were witnesses, people who had seen the way he treated Olivia. If word got out, if the police report became public, it could spell disaster for him and the restaurant. "I'm positive," Richard replied, his voice tighter than he intended. "It was a misunderstanding, like I said." But the officers didn't seem eager to leave. They exchanged a glance before Officer Martinez spoke again. "Mind if we take a look around, just to make sure everything's in order?" Richard clenched his jaw. He knew they weren't asking. They were making it clear that they intended to investigate the situation. No matter what he said, he could hardly refuse, not without drawing even more attention to himself. "Of course," Richard said with a forced smile, stepping aside to let the officers pass. As the officers made their way through the restaurant, Richard felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The ripple effects of his actions were spreading further and further, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. Meanwhile, in the private dining room, Olivia was sipping a glass of sparkling water, enjoying a moment of peace. The tension she had felt earlier had begun to dissipate, and the elegant ambience of the room allowed her to relax, if only for a little while. She had no idea that the police had arrived outside, or that the situation she had been embroiled in was still unfolding in unexpected ways. Olivia's mind drifted back to her earlier days, how many times she had been dismissed, judged, or mistreated simply because of the way she looked. Even after all these years, after all her success, it still happened. She had learned to navigate these situations with grace, but tonight had been a stark reminder of how pervasive prejudice remained. She glanced at her phone, the screen lighting up with a new email notification. It was from one of the charities she supported, a mentorship program for underprivileged girls of color. Olivia smiled as she read the update. The program was growing, and more young women were getting the support and resources they needed to succeed in a world that often tried to push them down. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Caroline again, this time looking more composed but still carrying the weight of the evening's events on her shoulders. "Ms. Davis," Caroline began, stepping into the room. "I just wanted to check on you. I hope you're finding everything to your satisfaction." Olivia gave a small nod. "Everything is fine. Thank you. I appreciate your attention to detail." Caroline hesitated, her eyes dropping for a moment before she spoke again. "I want to apologize once more for what happened earlier. I've spoken with the staff, and we're taking immediate steps to ensure this never happens again. Richard, the manager, will be dealt with accordingly." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Dealt with accordingly? What exactly does that mean?" Caroline sighed. He'll be removed from his position. We can't have someone representing our establishment who behaves like that, especially towards someone like you." Olivia studied Caroline for a moment, her mind turning over the situation. She appreciated the swift action, but there was something that didn't sit right with her about the idea of simply firing Richard. Would that really change anything? Or would it just be another example of sweeping the problem under the rug, only for it to resurface somewhere else? "Firing him might solve the immediate issue," Olivia said slowly, "but it won't address the bigger problem. If he goes somewhere else and continues to act the same way, nothing changes." Caroline looked surprised by Olivia's response. "What are you suggesting?" Olivia leaned forward slightly. "I'm suggesting that instead of simply firing him, you educate him. Give him the opportunity to understand the impact of his actions, really understand it. It's easy to dismiss someone and be done with it, but real change happens when people are given a chance to grow." Caroline was silent for a moment, clearly considering Olivia's words. "You're right," she said finally. "I hadn't thought about it that way. It's easier to just move on. But maybe you're right. Maybe we can find a way to help him learn from this." Olivia smiled. "It's worth trying. He won't change overnight, but if he's open to learning, there's hope. And that's what matters." Caroline nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I'll speak with him. We'll set up a program, something that can help him and the rest of the staff better understand the importance of diversity and inclusion." As Caroline left the room, Olivia felt a sense of calm settle over her. Tonight had been challenging, but it had also been a reminder of the power of kindness, patience, and redemption. Change didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened through conversations, actions, and the willingness to see things from a different perspective. But for Richard, the night was far from over. As he stood by the host's stand, watching the officers finish their sweep of the restaurant, he realized that his life was about to take a turn, one he hadn't seen coming. Confronting the mirror, as the police officers finished their walkthrough of the restaurant, the murmurs among the patrons subsided, leaving behind an air of tense unease. Richard stood stiffly by the host's stand, his face pale, beads of sweat forming on his brow. The once bustling atmosphere of La Maison d'Or felt suffocating now, and each glance cast his way by diners and staff alike felt like a dagger. The officers, having found no disturbance worth investigating, approached Richard once more. Officer Martinez glanced at his notepad, then up at the manager, his expression unreadable. "Everything seems to be in order here," Martin said, his voice neutral. "But next time, I'd suggest being more careful about making these calls. We don't appreciate being called for what seems like a misunderstanding." Richard forced a stiff smile. "Of course, officer. Thank you for your time." Martinez nodded but didn't return the pleasantries. The officers left the restaurant without another word, and as the door closed behind them, Richard finally exhaled. But the relief was short-lived. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him harder than ever. Caroline DuPont was still in the private dining room with Olivia Davis, and Richard knew that whatever conversation they were having wasn't likely to go in his favor. He had no illusions about his future here. Caroline was furious, and rightly so. He had nearly caused a scandal that could tarnish the reputation of her restaurant, and he had acted with such blatant prejudice that even he was struggling to justify his behavior. Richard swallowed hard as his thoughts churned. Growing up, he had never considered himself a racist, and he still didn't. His family had always emphasized respect and equality. Yet here he was, confronting an undeniable truth about himself. The assumptions he had made about Olivia Davis, based purely on her appearance, were rooted in something ugly, something he had never wanted to acknowledge. As he stared blankly at the rows of tables, his mind wandered back to earlier days. Richard hadn't always been a restaurant manager. Once, years ago, he had been a high school teacher in a small town, working with students from all walks of life. He had prided himself on treating everyone equally, regardless of race or background. So how had he ended up here, standing in one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city, guilty of the very thing he had taught his students to avoid. The thought gnawed at him. When had he started making these assumptions? Was it when he entered the high-end hospitality industry, where the clientele were almost exclusively white and wealthy? Or had it always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? He hadn't realized it then, but the years spent catering to the ultra-rich had warped his perceptions. Over time, he had begun to associate wealth and status with a particular look, a particular demeanor. And tonight, when Olivia Davis had walked through the doors, her presence had challenged everything he thought he knew about the people who frequented this space. The truth was, Richard had looked at Olivia and seen someone who didn't belong. He had seen her dark skin, her simple but elegant dress, and immediately assumed she was an outsider. And that realization, now glaringly obvious, made him feel sick to his core. As the minutes ticked by, Richard's thoughts grew darker. He had made a mistake, and it was one he couldn't take back. But could he make it right? He wasn't sure. A part of him wanted to disappear, to leave this place, and never look back. But another part, the part that still clung to the principles he had once held dear, knew he couldn't run from this. He had to face the consequences of his actions, even if that meant facing his own reflection in the mirror and acknowledging the ugliness he had allowed to fester. Just then, the door to the private dining room opened, and Caroline DuPont stepped out. She walked briskly toward Richard, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her expression hard but controlled. Richard straightened his posture, bracing himself for the worst. "Richard," Caroline began, her voice tight, "we need to talk." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Of course." She gestured toward a quieter corner of the restaurant, and he followed her, feeling the stares of the staff burning into his back as they walked. When they reached the corner, Caroline crossed her arms, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce intensity. "I've spoken with Ms. Davis," she said, her tone measured. "You need to understand the gravity of what happened tonight." Richard nodded again, his mouth dry. "I do. I made a mistake. A serious one." Caroline's eyes narrowed. "A mistake? Richard, this wasn't just a mistake. You acted with prejudice. You treated one of our most important guests as if she didn't belong here because of the way she looked. That's not just a mistake. That's a fundamental failure of judgment." Richard winced at her words, but he didn't argue. She was right, and he knew it. He had failed. "I know," he said quietly. "I see that now. I don't know what I was thinking. I've never thought of myself as someone who would." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The shame was too much. Caroline let out a slow breath, her expression softening just a fraction. "I believe you, Richard. I don't think you set out to be discriminatory. But that doesn't change the fact that you were. And now we have to deal with the consequences." Richard looked down at his hands, feeling a wave of guilt crash over him. "Are you firing me?" Caroline hesitated, and for a moment, Richard thought she might say yes. But then she shook her head, her gaze steady. "No, I'm not firing you," she said. "Not yet, anyway." Richard blinked in surprise. He had fully expected to be dismissed on the spot. "Ms. Davis made a point that struck me," Caroline continued. "She said that firing you won't solve the problem. It might make this incident go away, but it won't address the bigger issue at play here. She suggested that instead of just letting you go, we try to educate you, to help you understand the impact of your actions and give you the opportunity to grow from this." Richard stared at her, shocked. She said that." Caroline nodded. "She did. And frankly, I agree with her. You've been a valuable member of this team for years, Richard, but tonight you showed a side of yourself that I don't think you've ever fully confronted. I'm giving you a chance to do that now." Richard's mind raced. Part of him felt relieved. He wasn't being fired. But another part of him felt overwhelmed by the idea of confronting what he had done. Could he really change? Could he learn from this? "I'll do whatever it takes," Richard said finally, his voice steady. "I know I've got a lot to learn, and I'm willing to put in the work. I don't want to be the kind of person who makes these assumptions." Caroline studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Good, because we're not just going to sweep this under the rug. Starting next week, you're going to participate in diversity and inclusion training. Real training, not just a check-the-box exercise. And I expect you to take it seriously." Richard nodded vigorously. "I will. I promise." Caroline's expression softened further, but there was still a seriousness in her eyes. "I hope you do, Richard, because if I see even a hint of this kind of behavior again, you won't get another chance." "I understand," Richard said quietly. "And thank you for giving me the opportunity to make this right." Caroline nodded and turned to leave, but before she walked away, she paused and looked back at him. "One more thing," she said. "You owe Ms. Davis an apology. A real one." Richard swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had been dreading this, but he knew it was necessary. "I'll apologize to her. I'll make sure she knows how sorry I am." Caroline gave him a tight nod before walking away, leaving Richard standing alone in the quiet corner of the restaurant. For a long time, he didn't move. He just stood there, grappling with the weight of his actions and the long road ahead. He knew that one apology wouldn't undo the damage he had caused, but it was a start. And perhaps if he truly committed himself to change, he could become the person he had always thought he was, someone who judged people by their character, not by their appearance. Finally, with a deep breath, Richard made his way toward the private dining room where Olivia Davis was seated. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms were sweaty, but he knew what he had to do. He knocked gently on the door and waited, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. When the door opened and he saw Olivia's calm, steady gaze looking back at him, Richard felt a wave of humility wash over him. This was his chance to make things right, to learn, and to grow. A lesson in humility. As Richard stood in the doorway of the private dining room, the full weight of the moment settled on him like an anchor dragging him down. Olivia Davis, seated with quiet grace at a table by the window, looked up at him with an expression that was hard to read. Her eyes, steady and calm, held no trace of the anger or indignation he might have expected. Instead, there was something deeper, something far more unsettling to Richard, a kind of detached disappointment, as if she had seen this too many times before. For a moment, he faltered, unsure of how to begin. Apologizing to someone like Olivia Davis wasn't just about saying the right words. It was about confronting the uncomfortable truth of his actions, the biases that had led him to treat her the way he had. The silence stretched between them, and Richard could feel the tension building in his chest. Olivia, sensing his hesitation, gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please, sit." Richard nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he took the seat. He clasped his hands tightly in front of him, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Apologies, excuses, explanations, they all jumbled together, and none of them seemed adequate. Olivia watched him with a patient stillness, as if waiting for him to find his words. She had seen this before, people stumbling over their discomfort, unsure of how to navigate the chasm between their intentions and their actions. In truth, she had little interest in hearing another empty apology. What she wanted, what she always hoped for in these situations, was sincerity. But sincerity was rare, and too often people said what they thought would smooth things over rather than what they truly felt. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "Ms. Davis." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't even begin to cover what happened tonight, but I want you to know that I deeply regret how I treated you." Olivia nodded slightly, but she said nothing. She let the silence linger, forcing Richard to continue, to dig deeper. "I made assumptions about you," he went on, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I judged you based on your appearance, and I treated you unfairly. That's not who I want to be. It's not the kind of person I ever thought I was, but tonight, I realized that I've been blind to my own biases. Olivia's gaze didn't waver. She studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, any sign that this was just another performance, a way to cover up the embarrassment of being caught. Richard's breath quickened as he continued, feeling the weight of his own words. I can't imagine how many times you've had to deal with situations like this. People like me making assumptions, thinking they know who you are without even bothering to see you. And I'm so ashamed that I became one of those people tonight. A flicker of something crossed Olivia's face. Was it surprise? Richard couldn't tell, but whatever it was, it gave him the courage to keep going. I know an apology isn't enough, he said, his voice growing steadier. It's just words, and words don't change what happened. But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better. Caroline has given me the chance to stay on, but only if I undergo training, real training, about diversity and inclusion. And I'm going to take it seriously. Olivia's expression softened, just a fraction, as she leaned back in her chair. I appreciate that, she said finally, her voice calm but firm. But let me ask you this. Why does it take a situation like tonight for you to recognize the problem? Why did it take me, a wealthy, influential black woman, for you to realize you had these biases? Richard flinched at the question. He had been expecting it, but it still hit him like a punch to the gut. He had no good answer for her, no answer that would make his behavior excusable. I don't know, he admitted quietly. I think I've been blind to it for a long time. I've always thought of myself as someone who treats people fairly, but clearly that wasn't true. Maybe it's because I've spent so long in this industry, where wealth and status are tied to a certain image, that I've come to associate those things with certain types of people. But that's not an excuse. It's just the reality of how I've been thinking, and it's wrong. Olivia nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. That's the thing about bias, Richard. It's insidious. It creeps into your thoughts, your actions, and before you know it, you're making decisions based on stereotypes and assumptions without even realizing it. You've been in this industry for how long? About 15 years, Richard said. And in that time, how many people of color have walked through these doors and been treated like they didn't belong? Olivia's voice was calm, but the question carried a heavy weight. Richard felt his stomach drop. He had no idea how many people had faced the same treatment as Olivia that night. He hadn't kept track, hadn't even considered it, and that realization made him feel even worse. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia sighed softly, leaning forward slightly. Richard, I'm not here to punish you. I'm not interested in seeing you lose your job or being humiliated, but what I do want is for you to understand that this is about more than just you and me. It's about the countless people who are treated like second-class citizens every single day because of the color of their skin, their background, their gender, or their economic status. And most of those people don't have the power or the privilege to push back. Richard nodded, his throat tight. I understand that now. Do you? Olivia's tone sharpened slightly, challenging him. Because understanding isn't just about acknowledging the problem. It's about changing your behavior, your mindset. It's about making sure that every person who walks through those doors is treated with respect, regardless of what they look like or how much money you think they have. Can you honestly say you're ready to do that? Richard met her gaze, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He didn't want to make empty promises. He didn't want to say yes just to appease her, only to fall back into the same patterns. But he also knew that he couldn't walk away from this without at least trying to change. I am, he said after a long pause. I know it won't be easy, and I know I'll have to unlearn a lot of bad habits. But I want to do better. Not just for myself, but for the people I've wronged. People like you, and the others who've been treated unfairly by me or anyone else in this restaurant. I'm committed to making this right. Olivia studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. I hope you mean that, because if you do, You have the chance to make a real difference. Not just here, but in the lives of the people you come into contact with every day. It starts with you, Richard. It starts with being aware of your biases and making a conscious effort to challenge them. Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew this was only the beginning. "I won't let you down," he said quietly. Olivia gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'll hold you to that." With that, she stood, gracefully pushing her chair back. Richard quickly stood as well, feeling the mixture of gratitude and humility wash over him. "Thank you, Ms. Davis," Richard said, his voice filled with sincerity, "for giving me this chance." Olivia gave a small nod. "Just make sure you use it." As Olivia walked toward the door, Richard felt a sense of hope stir within him. Hope that he could change, that he could learn from this, and that maybe, just maybe, this experience would make him a better person. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt a real desire to confront the things he had been blind to for so long. As the door closed behind her, Richard stood alone in the private dining room, the soft hum of the restaurant outside a distant murmur. The conversation he had just had would stay with him forever, shaping the man he would become from this point forward. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: he would never forget this lesson in humility. The path to redemption. The days that followed were filled with an eerie sense of reflection for Richard Harlan. After his confrontation with Olivia Davis, he found himself standing at a crossroads, one that forced him to reckon with who he had been and who he wanted to become. The restaurant buzzed with its usual clientele, but Richard could no longer look at the guests without wondering if they, too, had experienced moments of prejudice at his hands or the hands of others like him. Each interaction became a mirror reflecting his past actions, and it weighed on him. He had thought that, as the manager of one of the city's most prestigious establishments, he was doing a good job maintaining its standards. But now he understood that the standards he had upheld were built on shaky foundations, ones that privileged certain people over others without him even realizing it. And that was perhaps the most difficult realization of all. He hadn't seen his own flaws because he had never bothered to look. Richard's first step on the road to redemption came in the form of the diversity and inclusion training that Caroline had mentioned. The restaurant's leadership had brought in a consultant, a no-nonsense woman named Angela Porter, who had years of experience guiding companies through the difficult process of addressing systemic bias and fostering inclusivity. Angela wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. In their first meeting, she made it clear that this wasn't going to be some feel-good exercise where people pat themselves on the back for attending a seminar. Richard would need to confront his biases head-on, and the process wouldn't be comfortable. Their first session was a one-on-one discussion. Angela sat across from Richard in the same private dining room where his world had been turned upside down just days earlier. The contrast between Olivia's calm but piercing presence and Angela's direct, no-nonsense demeanor made Richard uncomfortable, but he knew he couldn't shy away now. "I've looked over what happened the other night," Angela said, glancing at her notes. "Let's be clear, what you did wasn't just a bad decision. It was a product of implicit bias, and we're going to unpack that." Richard nodded, his throat tight. "I understand that now." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Do you? Because understanding it isn't the same as addressing it. Let's start by talking about where your assumptions come from." Richard hesitated, unsure of how to articulate the tangled web of thoughts in his mind. I think it's a combination of things," he began slowly. "I've been in this industry for so long, and most of our clientele looks a certain way. Wealthy, white, usually upper class. When someone doesn't fit that image, I guess, I make assumptions." "And what assumptions did you make about Olivia Davis when she walked through the door?" Richard winced at the directness of the question. He felt exposed, vulnerable. But there was no point in denying it. "I assumed she didn't belong," he admitted. "That she was trying to get into a place where she wasn't supposed to be. I thought she couldn't afford it, or that she didn't fit the mold of our usual guests. Angela leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. And why do you think you made that assumption? What was it about her that made you think she didn't belong? Richard swallowed, his face flushing with shame. Because she's black, and she wasn't dressed in a way that screamed wealth. I didn't even consider that she might be someone important, someone who had every right to be here. Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's what we're going to work on, Richard. The fact that you made those assumptions so easily, without even realizing it, means there's a lot of unlearning that needs to happen. You've built an idea in your head of who belongs in certain spaces, and that idea is based on stereotypes about race, wealth, and status. Richard felt his stomach churn. Hearing it laid out so plainly was painful, but it was the truth. He had allowed his unconscious biases to shape his interactions with people, and it had cost him his integrity. Over the next few weeks, Richard's training with Angela intensified. They covered everything from the history of systemic racism in the United States to the ways in which bias manifests in daily interactions, both consciously and unconsciously. Angela pushed him to reflect on his upbringing, his education, and the environments that had shaped his worldview. He realized that while he had never considered himself overtly racist, he had absorbed subtle messages throughout his life about who held power and who didn't, who was deserving of respect and who wasn't. One of the most challenging aspects of the training was the group sessions Angela conducted with the entire restaurant staff. Richard had to sit in a room with his colleagues, people he had worked with for years, and admit his failings. It was one thing to acknowledge his mistakes in private, but standing in front of the people he managed, exposing his flaws to them, was a different kind of humiliation. During one session, Angela asked the staff to share any experiences they had with bias or prejudice in the workplace. Richard sat quietly, listening as some of his employees, people he had thought he knew well, shared stories of microaggressions, assumptions, and subtle racism they had encountered, both from customers and from management. He was shocked to hear how many of those stories involved him, even if indirectly. I remember one time, a server named Alicia said, her voice hesitant but firm, I was waiting on a group of businessmen, and they kept calling me sweetheart and honey like I was their servant. I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't want to make a scene, but when I came to you, Richard, and told you about it, you just shrugged it off. You said it was part of the job, dealing with difficult customers. Richard's face burned with shame. He remembered the incident, but at the time, he hadn't thought much of it. Now, hearing Alicia's perspective, he realized how dismissive he had been. He had minimized her experience because it didn't seem like a big deal to him. But it was a big deal to her. I'm sorry, Alicia, Richard said quietly. I should have handled that differently. I didn't understand what you were going through, and I didn't take your concerns seriously. That was wrong. Alicia nodded, accepting his apology, but the hurt in her eyes was still there. Richard knew it would take more than words to make things right with his staff. He had a lot of trust to rebuild. By the time the final training session came around, Richard felt like he had been through an emotional ringer. He had faced some uncomfortable truths about himself, and the process had been grueling. But through it all, he had also started to see the world, and his role in it, with new eyes. He realized that being a good manager wasn't just about running a restaurant smoothly or keeping the customers happy. It was about creating an environment where everyone, employees and guests alike, felt respected and valued, regardless of their background. One evening, after the restaurant had closed and the last of the staff had gone home, Richard found himself standing alone in the dimly lit dining room. The chandeliers cast a soft glow over the tables, the silence almost reverent. He walked slowly between the tables, remembering the countless nights he had spent here, thinking he was doing everything right. But now he saw things differently. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Caroline. How's everything going? Just spoke with Angela. She's pleased with your progress. Richard smiled faintly. He was far from perfect, and he knew the road ahead would still be challenging. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. As he put his phone away, he thought about Olivia Davis. He hadn't seen her since their conversation in the private dining room, but her presence lingered in his mind. Her calm strength, her willingness to give him a second chance, it had been a turning point for him. That weekend, Richard made a decision. He reached out to Olivia through her assistant, asking if she would be willing to meet for coffee. He wasn't sure if she would agree, but he wanted to thank her personally, not just for her patience, but for challenging him to be better. A few days later, he received a response. Olivia had agreed to meet. They met at a quiet cafe downtown, far from the glitzy atmosphere of La Maison d'Or. When Olivia arrived, she greeted him with the same composed demeanor, though there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Richard said as they sat down. "I wanted to talk to you, not just to thank you for everything, but to let you know that I've been going through the training. I've been working with Angela, and it's been eye-opening, to say the least." Olivia nodded, sipping her coffee. "I'm glad to hear that. It's a long process, Richard. It doesn't happen overnight." "I know," Richard said, "but I'm committed to it. I don't want to be the person I was before. I want to be someone who understands, who listens, and who acts with respect and fairness." Olivia studied him for a moment before speaking. "I can see that you're trying, and that's a good start. But remember, it's not just about what you say in these moments. It's about how you live your life, how you run your business, and how you treat people every day." Richard nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep within him.